The lights flickered first. Not enough to cause alarm. Just enough for every person in that narrow West Wing hallway to stop breathing for half a second. By sunrise, staffers would insist they hadn't seen anything unusual. But the camera mounted above the Roosevelt corridor captured the moment clearly. The instant when a routine policy briefing spiraled into something no one had been prepared to witness. A door opened. Footsteps. A voice, sharp, clipped, unusually tense. Then another voice, heavier, charged like a live wire pulled too tight. The air itself seemed to contract. No one knew it then, but the confrontation that followed would ripple through every layer of Washington. It would spark rumors, ignite late-night cable debates, and trigger one of the most frantic internal leak investigations in modern White House history. And the footage. The footage that should never have existed. Was about to capture the first sparks of a confrontation between Donald J. Trump and Zohran Mamdani that would later be whispered about in staffer bars and shadowed conference rooms for weeks. But the real story hadn't even started. It began 5 minutes earlier. Aides moved briskly through the hallway, coffee cups in hand, stacks of briefing folders pressed to their chests. Phones buzzed relentlessly, polling updates, inbox alerts, overnight briefs. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing felt unusual. Until someone noticed Trump wasn't in the Oval. He was walking, fast, toward the Roosevelt room, jaw clenched, tie slightly off-center, expression locked somewhere between impatience and something sharper. Cameras later showed him holding a single sheet of paper, edges crumpled as though he'd gripped it too tightly. Behind him, 2 Secret Service agents. Flanking him, an aide trying, and failing, to keep pace. Inside the Roosevelt room, Mamdani was already waiting. He stood beside the long polished table, fingertips lightly touching its surface, his expression unreadable. Staffers around him whispered, policy disagreements, procedural disputes, a memo that had apparently been misunderstood or mishandled. But even then, something else hovered beneath the surface. Something unspoken. Because Mamdani didn't look frustrated. He didn't look impatient. He looked resolute. As if he had expected this moment, and was ready for it. Outside the glass panel on the door, a junior aide hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. He reached for the handle. Stopped. Pulled his hand back. And quietly stepped away. You've seen this before. That moment when instinct tells someone to run, even if they don't know why. That subtle shift in the air before a storm breaks. Something was coming. Something neither man could walk back from once it began. The camera angle tightened. Trump entered first. No greeting. No handshake. Just a brief, slicing glance. Mamdani didn't move. He remained perfectly still, as though bracing for the weight of what was about to land. You saw it? Trump said. Not loud. Not angry. But the tone was unmistakable, an undercurrent of disbelief, and offense. Mamdani nodded once. Trump exhaled sharply. Then you already know why I'm here. There was a pause, sharp, surgical, almost painful. Someone closed the door from the outside. The audio clip later leaked didn't include video, only muffled voices, strained breaths, and the scrape of a chair leg across the floor. But the combination of those sounds told a story far more powerful than the footage alone ever could. Inside, the tension thickened. This wasn't the agreement, Trump said. Mamdani responded, calm but firm. It wasn't an agreement. It was a conversation. A beat of silence. Then another. Staffers in nearby rooms exchanged glances, sensing vibrations through the thin office walls. Someone muted their Zoom call. Someone else turned down the volume on their laptop. Because even the corridor's usual hum had softened into an unnatural quiet. The kind that meant something big was unfolding behind a door no one wanted to open. And here's the part almost no one saw. Trump placed the crumpled paper on the table. Flattened it with his palm. Pushed it toward Mamdani. Not aggressively. But deliberately. Almost ceremonially. You put this into circulation? Trump asked. Mamdani didn't touch the paper. Didn't look down. Yes, he said. I did. What followed wasn't a shout. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was tension distilled into its purest form. Two men with conflicting visions, unspoken grievances, and a single document that had quietly detonated something neither could ignore. You should have come to me first, Trump said. Mamdani's reply was immediate. Measured. Prepared. I did. You dismissed it. Trump shook his head. That's not how this place works. Mamdani stepped closer. Maybe that's the problem. The temperature shifted. A tiny click from the vent overhead punctuated the silence like a dropped pin. Screens lit up across the West Wing. New alerts. New messages. New speculation. Are you trying to make this public? Trump asked. No, Mamdani said. But I'm not hiding it either. Trump's shoulders lifted with a slow inhale. The kind of breath taken by someone calculating consequences in real time. You're pushing this too far. And you're avoiding it. You felt this once, didn't you? That moment when two forces collide, not with noise, but with quiet certainty. The kind that rearranges everything. The leak would come later. The debate would come later. The fallout, inevitable, messy, unstoppable, would come later. But right here, in this windowless room, under fluorescent lights that hummed like electrified nerves, something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't a dispute. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a break. A clean, irreversible fracture. And when fractures spread, they do so silently at first. Officials passing by the hallway glanced toward the door without meaning to. A staffer dropped her pen. A janitor paused, listening. Some stories begin with headlines. This one began with tension so dense it felt gravitational. And then. A voice rose. Not loud. Not sharp. But unmistakably strained. Trump leaned forward. Mamdani didn't back down. I won't rescind it, Mamdani said. You may not have a choice, Trump replied. Another silence. The kind that rearranges destinies. Because at that exact second. As two men locked eyes, as a simple memo became a fault line, as the walls themselves seemed to hold their breath. A tiny red indicator lit up on the camera outside the door. Recording. Documenting. Capturing a moment no one was supposed to see. What happened in the next 3 minutes would ignite the leak, the investigation, and the political firestorm that followed. But the real story. The real story was still buried beneath the surface. And almost no one had noticed the first crack. Not yet. Long before the confrontation leaked. Before the headlines. Before the internal scramble. Before the whispers slid through DC elevators like static. The story had roots no one bothered to trace. Stories always do. They never start with the explosion. They start with the crack beneath the surface. The small, almost invisible pressure that builds until everything finally gives way. And this one began years earlier. With two very different men. Two very different worlds. And one quiet truth neither of them liked acknowledging. They were more alike than either wanted to admit. But the real story hadn't even started. Trump grew up in a world where ceilings were meant to be shattered. Walls were meant to be pushed through. And hesitation was a luxury nobody rewarded. You know this feeling. The American pace. The pressure to move fast. To decide fast. To act fast. Winning wasn't the goal. Winning was the oxygen. And from his earliest days, Trump carried something he rarely spoke about. A fear not of failure. But of irrelevance. The childhood scar no documentary had ever quite captured wasn't a moment or a memory. It was a sensation. The sensation of standing still. He hated stillness. Stillness meant losing ground. Stillness meant someone else taking the frame. Stillness meant the world shifting without him at the center of its pull. This fear followed him into business. Into television. Into politics. It shaped every instinct, every calculation, every confrontation. But something in him was shifting. He just didn't know what was coming. Mamdani came from almost the opposite world. A quieter world. Not softer. Just quieter in its intensity. He grew up watching his parents navigate a life built from worn-out couches, evening news broadcasts, laminated textbooks, and conversations that stretched from the kitchen table late into the night. His childhood scar was different. Not a fear of stillness. But a fear of silence. Silence meant people weren't being heard. Silence meant decisions were being made without those they affected. Silence meant the world would keep turning even if someone was left behind. So he spoke. Sometimes too loudly. Sometimes too early. Sometimes without waiting his turn. Teachers called him idealistic. Friends called him unrelenting. His family called him a storm. But storms don't just arrive. They gather. And something in him was gathering too. A pressure that had been building long before he stepped into the Roosevelt room that morning. He had not expected Trump to agree with him. He had expected something else. A conversation, a negotiation, even a conflict. What he had not expected was dismissal. That was the trigger. Not the memo. Not the wording. Not the politics. The dismissal. It echoed the kind he'd heard years earlier. Sitting at a diner booth off Queens Boulevard. Blue vinyl seat cracked down the middle. Scent of burnt coffee hanging in the air. When an older neighbor had patted his arm and said, "That's not how the world works, kid." He'd been 14. And he'd hated those words ever since. The executive house, what staffers privately called the West Wing to avoid attaching blame. Runs on a rhythm the public never sees. High-pressure rooms. Low-lit hallways. Late-night strategizing. Cold hamburgers eaten at desks. Notes scribbled on napkins. People arguing over commas and consequences. But always. Always. There is hierarchy. People climb. People circle. People calculate. And both Trump and Mamdani understood hierarchy deeply. Though from opposite directions. Trump climbed because he was expected to. Mamdani climbed because he wasn't supposed to. Both paths lead somewhere heavy. Both paths eventually collide. You felt this once, didn't you? The collision of two stories that were never meant to meet. But did anyway. 2 weeks before the explosive leak. A late-night conversation had set everything in motion. Mamdani had been sitting alone in his office. Staring at a draft that didn't feel right. Every line felt too safe. Too softened. Too diluted. He wasn't writing for television. He wasn't writing for history. He was writing for the people who couldn't walk these hallways. Who didn't get invited into these rooms. A thought formed. Clear. Sharp. Dangerous. What if the system isn't listening? He pushed the draft aside. Opened a fresh document. Let the words come out unfiltered. He didn't know that the document would reach Trump's desk. He didn't know an aide would flag it. He didn't know a single sentence, one bold, unpolished line, would become the ignition point. A single detail fractured everything. But he wrote it anyway. Because silence, to him, was the real threat. And Trump. Trump received the memo at 6:42 a.m. He was seated at the resolute desk. Sunlight barely cutting through the curtains. Coffee cooling faster than he could drink it. He read the first paragraph. Fine. The second. Questioning. The third. Uncomfortable. The fourth. Something tightened in his chest. He didn't call for clarification. He didn't ask for context. He didn't consult advisors. He circled a single sentence with a thick black pen. Stayed awake for hours replaying it. Not because it was wrong. But because it touched the part of him he kept locked away. The fear of losing the frame. People in power always have a sentence they cannot forgive. This one was his. And here's the part almost no one saw. He wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. He was afraid. Afraid that the world, his world, was inching toward a place he could no longer predict or control. Afraid that someone like Mamdani, with his relentless idealism, his refusal to soften, his insistence on being heard, might represent a direction that made Trump feel peripheral. Peripheral was unacceptable. Irrelevance was unbearable. And so, without thinking, without breathing, without cooling down, Trump stood, grabbed the memo, walked toward the Roosevelt Room. The same room where, minutes later, a camera would silently capture the first sparks of the confrontation heard around Washington. But the real pressure, the real shift, began decades before either man imagined they'd ever stand face to face in the nation's most scrutinized building. You know this feeling. The sense that two lifetimes were quietly barreling toward a collision point. Whether they liked it or not. Whether they were ready or not. And in the dimly lit corridors of power, where ambition breathes, where ideals harden, where fear gains shape, the roots of the clash tightened their grip. Growing. Twisting. Pulling two men toward a moment they could no longer avoid. The storm was coming. And neither man had learned how to step back once the sky began to darken. The leak didn't happen right away. Pressure rarely releases in an instant. It builds, quietly, invisibly, until the system around it can't contain the force anymore. And that morning, inside the executive house, the system was beginning to buckle. At first, the reports looked normal. Routine. Unremarkable. Then a single detail fractured everything. But the real story hadn't even started. 3 minutes after Trump and Mamdani's confrontation began, a staffer named Ellis Keaton received an alert on his tablet. A minor systems message about a temporary video backup transferring from corridor cameras to the secure server. It was nothing unusual. It happened dozens of times a day. But this time, the status line read: Buffering, Roosevelt Room, live sync delay. Ellis frowned. That room rarely synced late. He tapped the feed. Audio waves flickered. Muffled voices. Something sharp. Something strained. He froze. You hearing this? A colleague whispered from across the bullpen. Ellis didn't answer. Because the closer he listened, the clearer it became that he had stumbled into something he wasn't supposed to hear. Not a policy disagreement. Not a strategy debate. Something else. Something heavier. You've seen this before, haven't you? When curiosity collides with fear. The moment someone realizes they're witnessing the beginning of something explosive. Ellis took off his headphones. His hands trembled slightly. No one had told him to monitor the feed. No one had authorized him to listen. But once you hear a spark, you can't unhear the fire behind it. Inside the Roosevelt Room, the conversation shifted. Trump leaned closer, eyes narrowed. Why escalate this? Why now? Mamdani didn't flinch. You call it escalation. I call it direction. Direction? Trump scoffed. You're not running the show. I'm not trying to, Mamdani replied. But I'm not playing small either. The words dropped like weighted stones. Hierarchy doesn't like being challenged. Systems don't like being questioned. Power always tests the perimeter when threatened. Trump wasn't shouting. He was calculating. Measuring. Adjusting the unspoken rules that governed every room he entered. And that was the moment the rule shift began. When authority met resistance. Not loud. Not rebellious. But calm. Steady. And unwilling to bend. It's the calm ones who change the story. The quiet ones. The ones who don't break when pushed. The real danger wasn't change. It was who controlled the definition of normal. Down the hall, the briefing team was gathering in the communications office. Screens glowed with bullet points and talking points. Morning clips and press inquiries. All the ordinary chaos of a White House morning. But whispers spread. Did you hear something? Is there a meeting we didn't know about? What's going on in the Roosevelt room? People pretended not to be curious. Pretended not to listen. Pretended not to piece together the fragments. But humans always piece together fragments. It's how stories survive. A junior staffer named Lonnie crossed the hallway, paused near the Roosevelt room, and pressed her ear, very lightly, against the wood. A single sentence filtered through. You're creating a narrative that doesn't exist. She stepped back. Narrative. The most dangerous word in Washington. Because narratives don't need votes. They don't need committees. They don't need approval. They only need oxygen. And someone. Someone with enough clarity. Enough confidence. Enough resolve. Could turn oxygen into wildfire. Here's where the tension thickened. Trump sat down. A slow, deliberate move. The kind that said he wasn't walking away. Mamdani remained standing. This tiny imbalance. One seated, one upright. Shifted the emotional geometry of the room. Trump looked up at him. You think you're the only one who sees problems? No, Mamdani replied softly. But I'm one of the few saying them out loud. Trump tapped the paper on the table. That sentence you wrote? You know the kind of storm it will create? Yes, Mamdani said. And maybe the storm is overdue. Trump's expression tightened. Storms were familiar to him. But only the kind he chose. The kind he directed. The kind he knew how to shape. Uncontrolled storms. Those were different. Those were dangerous. A faint buzz echoed from the overhead light. A small, almost imperceptible vibration. Neither man noticed. But Ellis did, listening from his tablet. He heard the tremor in their voices. He heard the rising intensity. He heard the moment when two trajectories stopped circling each other and finally collided. He also heard something else. A shift in the air. A tremor in the room. The sharp inhale before something irreversible happened. He pulled off his headphones again. What do I do? He whispered to himself. He wasn't talking about reporting it. Or hiding it. Or flagging it. He meant. What do I do with the truth I'm suddenly holding in my hands? You've asked this question too. Back inside the room, the twist arrived. Trump leaned back, folded his arms, and said. You know this won't stay quiet. Mamdani met his gaze. I'm not the one trying to keep it quiet. A beat. A pause. A shift. Because in that single line, Trump understood something he hadn't realized until now. Mamdani wasn't playing by the building's old rules. He wasn't seeking permission. He wasn't seeking protection. He wasn't seeking favor. He was seeking impact. And impact doesn't ask for consent. At that realization, for the first time since Trump had entered the room, he looked unsettled. A quiet unsettled. A restrained unsettled. But unsettled nonetheless. The kind that hinted at a bigger storm forming behind his eyes. He reached toward the paper again. But before he touched it. Before he reclaimed control. Before he could reshape the moment. A knock at the door. Sharp. Sudden. Uninvited. Both men turned. The handle twitched. Another knock. Then. A voice from outside. "Sir. You'll want to see this." Trump rose instantly. Mamdani stayed still. Something was happening in the hallway. Something neither man had anticipated. Something that added another fracture to an already unstable moment. Trump opened the door. Aides rushed forward. Screens glowed. Phones buzzed. Faces drained. Ellis stood at the end of the corridor, pale, holding his tablet like a piece of evidence he didn't want but couldn't let go of. The tension had broken containment. Information had begun to leak inside the building. Not to the public. Not yet. But to the one place where secrets die fastest. A hallway full of people who understood power far too well. Trump's eyes narrowed. Mamdani stepped forward. Nobody knew it yet. But what happened next would define the next 48 hours of Washington. Because the confrontation was no longer contained in a room. It was moving. Growing. Gathering witnesses. And the moment Trump reached Ellis. The moment he saw what the staffer was holding. The trajectory of the entire story shifted. Not because of the confrontation. Not because of the memo. But because of a single line of text on Ellis's screen. A timestamp. A recording indicator. Proof that something had been captured. Something no one intended to archive. Something the system was never built to protect. And as Trump stared at the screen. As Mamdani waited behind him. As staffers held their breath. The first real twist landed. Heavy. Undeniable. Irreversible. Someone, somewhere. Had already pulled the footage. And now the leak was inevitable. There's a moment, barely a flicker, when you realize the story you're chasing is no longer just a story. It begins to chase you back. And in those early days, buried inside federal servers and half-corrupted court scans, a pattern started to form. Not a clean line. Not a neat timeline. A thread, thin, frayed, and almost deliberately obscured. A phantom thread. It connected judges who never ruled. Witnesses who disappeared, legally, on paper. Dates that didn't match. Phone logs that stopped too early. And money transfers that began too late. A system that didn't merely fail. It folded, like someone pressing a crease into history. But the most haunting part wasn't the omissions. It was the silence. Because silence isn't the absence of noise. Silence is a signal. Silence means someone decided you don't get to know. And when investigators tried to follow that phantom thread, they found something strange. Everywhere they went, doors weren't just closed. They were already locked, from the inside. As if someone had been expecting them. And in that moment, the question shifted. This wasn't about who did what. It was about who controlled the story of what happened. That's when you realize. You're not uncovering a truth. You're trespassing on one. There is a point in every investigation where the air changes. Not because of what you found. But because of what starts watching you back. That moment arrived quietly. No alarms. No breaking news. Just a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, the kind that makes the fluorescent lights above you feel colder, and the documents in your hands suddenly heavier. Because the deeper we pulled on that phantom thread, the more it became clear. The events we were tracing weren't random. They weren't chaotic. They weren't even improvised. They were engineered. Someone, or more accurately, some circle, didn't just benefit from the silence. They designed it. You could see their fingerprints in the margins of forgotten memos. In the convenient reshuffling of prosecutors. In the technical failures that happened at precisely the wrong moments. In the legal loopholes that appeared like trapdoors, right when accountability got too close. This wasn't protection. This was architecture. Shadow architecture. The type built not with concrete and steel, but with influence, access, and the unspoken understanding that certain people live outside the reach of consequence. People who don't break the system. They write the system. Call logs that vanished before subpoenas were even drafted. Flight manifests edited without explanation. Internal emails with subject lines but no bodies, as if the content had been swallowed whole. These weren't accidents. They were blueprints. And when you map them, when you lay them out end to end, you start to see the outline of something much bigger than any single scandal. A structure. A network. A machine. Not run by politicians. Not run by celebrities. Not run by any one individual. But by those who operate in the blind spots. Those who understand that the most powerful place to exist is where no one is allowed to look. And as we traced this blueprint across agencies, courts, and institutions, one realization hit harder than all the others. The truth isn't hidden behind walls. It's hidden behind people who think they own the truth. People who don't fear exposure. Because they believe exposure will never reach them. And for decades. They were right. For every perfectly engineered system. For every silent corridor of influence. There's always one flaw. Not a crack in the wall. A crack in the people who built it. And in this case, the crack appeared in the form of a man who never intended to be a whistleblower. Never saw himself as a savior. Never even realized he was carrying the match that could burn the whole structure down. He was mid-level. Forgettable. One of those government workers whose badge works but whose name never matters. The kind of man who does his job, signs his forms, and disappears into the elevator at 5 o'clock like a ghost. But ghosts have memories. And he remembered something odd, a detail so small it should have meant nothing. A signature on a clearance form that wasn't supposed to be there. A timestamp that contradicted an internal log. A name appearing on a restricted access sheet weeks before the case even existed. One error. One misstep. One moment when the mask slipped. At first, he didn't think much of it. People make mistakes. Systems glitch. Paperwork lies. But then he noticed the same name again. Tucked inside a sealed brief. Stamped on a transaction authorization. Buried in the metadata of an email that had been wiped clean everywhere else. A pattern. Thin. Fragile. But unmistakable. And patterns, once seen, can't be unseen. The more he noticed, the more the structure around him changed. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. His access credentials were accidentally revoked. Supervisors he'd known for years suddenly treated him like he was radioactive. It wasn't paranoia. It was choreography. Someone, somewhere, had realized he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to. And in that moment, for the first time in his long, unremarkable career, he felt the weight of a truth people rarely admit. Sometimes the system doesn't protect you. Sometimes the system protects itself from you. His choice was simple, but impossible. Pretend he saw nothing. Or pull the thread that could unravel everything. And late one night, long after the hallways emptied, long after the screens dimmed to blue, he made a decision. He reached out. Quietly. Anonymously. A message sent to someone who shouldn't have existed in the official directory. A message that said just 4 words. I think you missed something. That was the moment the story shifted. That was the moment the shadow architects felt movement in the dark. That was the moment the mask cracked. And the truth, for the first time, began to breathe. There's a rule inside every federal building. Never open a door you weren't told to open. Not because of what's behind it, but because of what it means if you do. But on a rainy Thursday evening, with the cleaning staff already gone and the security cameras humming in their blind cycle, someone opened one anyway. Not by force. Not by hacking. Just, with a keycard that shouldn't have worked. A door marked with nothing but a single frosted pane. No department name. No case number. Just a thin strip of glass that hid more than it revealed. And when the door clicked open, it didn't swing like a workspace. It breathed like a vault. Inside, the air was colder. Dry. Preserved. Rows of metal cabinets lined the walls, no labels, no markers, no sign they existed in any inventory. This wasn't storage. This was containment. And sitting in the center of the room was a single desk. One lamp. One folder. A folder stamped not with a case file, but with a date. A date that, until that moment, had been erased from every public record of the investigation. A date that shouldn't exist. He opened it. Hands shaking, breath thin, heartbeat hammering in the quiet. Inside were documents that felt impossible. A draft indictment never filed. A list of names crossed out in red ink. A timeline that contradicted the official narrative. Communication logs between agencies that publicly denied ever talking. And a receipt, a simple, mundane receipt, that placed a key figure in a location they swore they'd never been. Every piece inside that folder was small. Forgettable. Microscopic. But together, they formed a picture that wasn't just different from the official story. It obliterated it. There was no conspiracy theory. No dramatic twist. No cinematic villain. Just a truth that had been bent. Pressed. And repainted. By people who understood something most citizens don't. Information isn't power. Control of information is power. The man stood there, surrounded by evidence no one was supposed to see. Feeling not triumphant, but terrified. Because opening that door hadn't revealed the truth. It had revealed that the truth had been managed. Curated. Edited. Engineered by hands that left no fingerprints. He wasn't in a room full of secrets. He was in a room full of versions. Versions that never made it to daylight. Versions that could destroy careers, reputations, entire institutions if spoken aloud. Versions that had been quietly buried, until the wrong keycard opened the wrong door. And for the first time, he understood the gravity of what he'd stepped into. He wasn't just holding evidence. He was holding the reason the evidence was hidden. A reason powerful enough that people would silence anyone who got too close. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He didn't even breathe for a moment. He just stood there, in that cold, unmarked room, holding a folder that felt heavier than steel. He had no training for this. No roadmap. No mentor whispering instructions through an earpiece. He was a mid-level analyst. A man whose entire career had been built on quiet diligence, harmless paperwork, and coffee-stained cubicles. He wasn't a whistleblower. He wasn't a hero. He was ordinary. But sometimes, ordinary people open the wrong door. Or the right one. He slid the folder back onto the desk, carefully, almost reverently, and looked around the room again. His eyes scanned every detail now with a new awareness. The missing ID labels on the cabinets. The ventilation system that hummed louder than it should. The absence of dust where dust should have been. Someone was maintaining this place in secret. Someone who expected it to stay sealed. And that thought, that simple, quiet thought, cracked something inside him. You know this feeling. The moment when curiosity stops being safe. He stepped toward the nearest cabinet, hand trembling not from fear, but from the raw electricity of forbidden knowledge. The handle was warm. Recently touched. He opened it. Inside, dozens of sealed envelopes. No names. No dates. Just symbols, geometric shapes stamped in black ink. A triangle. A circle. A line. Code. He took one envelope, pulled it halfway out, then stopped. Because on the underside, hidden unless someone fully removed it, was a marking. One he recognized from his years in the archives. A classification level that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. A category eliminated over a decade ago. This wasn't old stock. This was active. The hum in the room grew louder. Or maybe his pulse did. Hard to tell. He put the envelope back. And as he closed the cabinet, he caught a reflection in the metal, a faint outline behind him. He turned sharply. Nothing. Just the door. Slightly more ajar than before. Had he left it like that? He wasn't sure anymore. That's when the realization struck him with surgical clarity. Someone else had access to this room. Someone who could enter without being noticed. Someone who expected silence, the obedient kind. And he had just crossed an invisible line. The line between worker and witness. He felt it in his chest, not quite fear, not quite adrenaline, but that dangerous mix of both. The feeling that something had shifted. Inside him. Around him. Against him. He closed the cabinet. Turned off the lamp. Flattened his breath. And walked out. Quiet. Deliberate. Like someone pretending nothing had changed. But something had changed. Everything had. And as the door clicked shut behind him, that soft, almost polite sound, another thought pierced through his mind, sharp as broken glass. Someone would notice the door had been opened. And when they did, they would start looking for the person who opened it. The hallways of power are rarely silent. Not truly. Even when the corridors seem empty. You can hear it if you listen carefully. The faint hum of servers. The scrape of a chair pushed too far back. The whispered conversations that vanish before you can catch a word. That morning, after the analyst had stepped out of the unmarked room, the whispers began. Not loud enough to alarm anyone. Not blatant enough to make a record. Just enough to ripple across offices. Through cubicles. Into conference rooms. You saw it, someone asked under their breath. I don't think anyone's supposed to notice, said another. And then the cognitive loops began. The little details that make people replay a scene in their minds over and over. The misplaced folder on a desk. The half-lit cabinet in the corner. The flicker of movement in a reflection that may not have been there at all. Every staffer became hyper-aware without knowing why. Every step in the corridor felt heavier. Every whispered word carried the weight of potential exposure. You felt this before. That subtle shift in the air when you realize something is happening that everyone else is pretending not to see. That tremor beneath normalcy that pulls you forward and backward at the same time. Trump was already in motion. By the time the whispers reached him, he had sensed the edges of instability. The tiny irregularities in memos, in schedules, in hallway chatter. He understood, instinctively, that this wasn't just about a single memo or even a confrontation with Mamdani. This was larger. More intricate. And it was spreading, quietly, like a virus no one could contain. He summoned aides one by one. Questions, instructions, double checks. Movement. Motion. Control. Mamdani, meanwhile, remained in his own orbit. A calm storm. Fully aware that whispers could become leaks. Fully aware that every subtle glance, every small note, every unopened door had already begun to rewrite what power looked like that day. And it did not go unnoticed. Ellis Keaton, the analyst, returned to his desk. The tablet buzzed in his hands. Screens flashed. An alert pinged, Roosevelt Room, live sync completed. The footage he had almost ignored now existed in the digital archive. Every breath. Every pause. Every subtle movement between Trump and Mamdani. He stared at the screen, frozen. Not because it was incriminating. Not because it was shocking. But because it was alive. This wasn't paper. This wasn't a note. This wasn't bureaucracy. This was truth in motion, and it had started before anyone realized it. The whispers in the hall multiplied. Staffers in nearby offices whispered to each other. Phones were checked. Emails were glanced at. Screens were tilted. Every ordinary act became a probe. People were listening to sounds they didn't understand. Watching movements they didn't yet interpret. Feeling pressures they couldn't yet define. And in that charged atmosphere, a dangerous paradox took shape. The closer people got to the truth, the less certain they were about it. Then came the first overt signal. A door opened, not the unmarked one, but a conference room across the hall. Two aides entered, hurried, with a folder clutched like a lifeline. They whispered urgently. They paused, glanced over their shoulders. And in that pause, something unspoken passed between them. They knew the analyst had seen something. Something significant. Something that could no longer be ignored. Trump's presence loomed quietly. He didn't need to see the folder. He could feel its existence. The weight of it. The inevitability. Mamdani's awareness mirrored it. He knew that the conversation, the folder, the minor glitches in procedure, they were all threads now unraveling. And while Trump sought control, Mamdani simply observed. Because control and observation are not the same. And in that difference lay the tension that could break a room, a building, or even a system. Ellis leaned back in his chair. The tablet on his lap felt like a trigger. A spark. A warning. And as the hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the soft shuffle of papers and chairs down the hall, he realized the hallways were no longer just passageways. They were amplifiers. Every whispered word. Every subtle movement. Every fraction of sound and light. Everything in those halls now contributed to the narrative, whether anyone intended it to or not. And the analyst understood, for the first time, that he wasn't merely observing. He was participating. Every step he took, every glance, every breath, part of a story being written without his permission. That's when the tension peaked. Power, secrecy, ambition, and truth, all collided in a quiet corridor, unseen, unheard. Yet utterly unstoppable. Even the strongest walls eventually show cracks. Not with a bang. Not with alarms. But quietly, in the small details that no one notices until it's too late. And that morning, in the corridors of power, the first cracks appeared. Ellis Keaton sat at his desk, the tablet glowing faintly in the dim office light. He wasn't supposed to hold it. He wasn't supposed to watch the footage. He wasn't supposed to know. And yet, every subtle movement, every glance, every sigh between Trump and Mamdani replayed across his screen. It wasn't just tension. It was a rhythm. A cadence of power being tested, examined, and challenged. And he understood something crucial. This was bigger than personalities. This was a system reacting to itself. The first sign of trouble wasn't public. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a memo. It was a reaction. A brief, almost imperceptible shift in behavior. Staffers hesitated before entering rooms. Phones were silenced. Schedules were changed without notice. Even the security cameras, normally invisible, seemed to follow him differently. Different angles. Different focus. As if the building itself were aware. You felt this before. That eerie sensation that someone is watching. Even when no one is there. Even when it should be impossible. And the truth of it? It wasn't impossible. It was inevitable. Mamdani, meanwhile, moved through the West Wing with a calm that belied the storm he had just witnessed. He understood that confrontation wasn't about winning a fight. It was about exposing the tension the system could no longer contain. "You've seen this before," he murmured to himself in the quiet of his office. Watching monitors that traced the ripple effects of his decision to speak openly. Not for the cameras. Not for attention. But because silence had been the true weapon all along. And now it was turning on its architects. The cracks spread quietly, almost surgically. A misfiled document in one office. A hurriedly deleted email in another. A schedule change that confused even the most seasoned aides. Nothing monumental. Nothing intentional. But together, these small errors formed a network. A fragile lattice of chaos that no one could have predicted. And at the center of it all, two men, Trump and Mamdani, both unaware that the system they operated in was already reacting to their confrontation. Both unaware that the ripple from a single memo, a single folder, a single unseen line of code, could bend the flow of an entire administration. Ellis Keaton typed cautiously. Every keystroke a decision. Every glance at the tablet a risk. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't a policymaker. He was simply the holder of information. But sometimes, being a witness is all it takes to become a participant. And as he stared at the footage, he realized something essential. Truth, when released, even in the smallest doses, has a momentum all its own. He leaned back. The hum of the building seemed louder now. The air heavier. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, as though acknowledging the cracks spreading beneath them. By late morning, whispers had grown louder. Not outside the West Wing. Not in press releases or televised coverage. But inside. Hallway conversations that were once mundane became rehearsals for tension. Every aide, every assistant, every junior staffer felt it. A change in the air. A weight pressing down. And for the first time, they realized that the system wasn't failing because of incompetence. It was failing because the truth had started to move. And no one, not Trump, not Mamdani, not any of the aides scrambling to regain composure could stop it. Because momentum doesn't negotiate. Momentum doesn't apologize. Momentum only is. And in that moment, the first cracks became visible. Not loud. Not dramatic. But undeniable. Power, control, secrecy, all beginning to fracture at the edges. And when cracks appear, they don't just grow. They multiply. They intersect. They become impossible to ignore. And for those inside the West Wing that day, for the first time, it felt as though the building itself might be listening. Watching. Judging. Because systems, like people, react to pressure. And no one inside that historic structure had yet learned how to handle the weight of what was coming. Silence is never empty. It carries weight. It shapes behavior. It whispers truths the loudest voices often miss. And in the days following the Roosevelt Room confrontation, silence became evidence. Not in the courts. Not on the record. But in the spaces between meetings, behind closed doors, and in the corridors where aides exchanged knowing glances. Something was happening. Something unspoken. Something that no memo could capture. Ellis Keaton returned to the unmarked folder. Every time he opened it, every time he glanced at the footage, he noticed things he hadn't before. The tilt of a head. The pause between words. The way power shifted in microseconds when one man spoke and the other reacted. It wasn't just about what was said. It was about what wasn't. You've seen this before. Moments where the absence of action tells you more than any statement ever could. Where a silence carries intention, threat, or surrender. And the footage, silent, unbroken, uncensored, held it all. Trump's aides tried to anticipate the fallout. Every meeting, every phone call, every briefing became a calculation. They analyzed schedules, parsed emails, cross-checked conversations. But none of it captured the silent truth. The confrontation had already created momentum that couldn't be recalled. Mamdani, too, moved carefully. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't announce victories. He simply existed in the spaces where the system faltered. A quiet observer, noting the cracks, watching the tremors ripple outward. Because power, when exposed to truth, reacts first in silence. Then in panic. Then in chaos. And the first ripple reached the communications office. Phones rang. Emails pinged. Staff whispered. A single message circulated among a small circle. Check the timestamps. Something's off. It wasn't dramatic. No alarms. No shouts. Just a quiet nudge. A suggestion that led to investigation. And the more they checked, the more anomalies appeared. A document sent a day too late. An email erased before reading. A folder marked confidential, but missing pages. Every small irregularity was like a pebble dropped in water. The ripples expanded, intersected, overlapped. And soon, no one could ignore the tremors. In those quiet moments, Ellis understood the paradox. The system had been designed to hide the truth. And yet, it couldn't hide from itself. Every misfiled memo, every overlooked log, every deleted record betrayed the system's own fragility. The silence that once protected power now revealed weakness. It was a lesson learned in the most American way possible. Information can't be fully controlled. Not when people are watching. Not when someone, even an ordinary analyst, chooses to pay attention. That evening, the West Wing felt different. The air was heavier. The lights seemed dimmer. Even the hum of computers carried a sharper edge. Conversations that would normally drift casually now paused. A word chosen carefully. A glance lingering too long. A document double-checked. People were aware. Not of what had happened. But that something had happened. And the acknowledgement of an invisible event is sometimes more dangerous than the event itself. Because you cannot unsee it. You cannot unhear it. You cannot unknow it. And as the sun set, painting the West Wing in streaks of orange and gray, one fact became undeniable. The confrontation was no longer confined to a single room. It had spread. It had infiltrated the building. It had changed the rhythm of power. And in the spaces where no one dared to look, silent evidence waited. Patient. Unyielding. Ready to speak when the time came. By the second week, the threads were no longer thin. They had multiplied. Intertwined. Spun into knots so tight that anyone trying to follow them risked being lost entirely. The folder. The footage. The timestamps. The whispers. All threads weaving together into a tapestry no one had anticipated. And yet, even as the complexity grew, one truth remained. Every thread led back to choices. Small choices. Almost invisible. Decisions made in corridors, offices, and conference rooms that seemed trivial at the time. But in retrospect, devastating. Ellis Keaton felt it. Each day, the weight of what he had uncovered pressed down harder. Not because the material was dangerous. Not because he feared for himself. But because the implications were enormous. Power wasn't just about controlling people. Power was about controlling the story. And now, the story was no longer under control. He began tracing connections, meticulously. A deleted email. A rescheduled meeting. A folder misfiled deliberately. Each small irregularity was a breadcrumb. Each breadcrumb hinted at a deeper network, one that extended beyond any single office, any single floor, any single agency. And with each discovery, the tension escalated. Trump was aware. He sensed the system shuddering around him. Even before aides whispered, before memos went missing, before the footage became known, he could feel the shift. Power is not just a position. It's a rhythm. A cadence of expectation and obedience. And the rhythm was off. Mamdani understood it too. Quietly observing, noting reactions, anticipating movement. He wasn't trying to break the system, he simply moved in a way that revealed its fractures. Because sometimes, exposure is a weapon. Across the West Wing, staff began connecting dots they hadn't realized existed. An email to one office referenced a document that never arrived. A call from a senior aide contradicted an official memo. A clearance level that didn't exist appeared in the logs. The ordinary became extraordinary. The mundane became pivotal. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the structure of control began to falter. Ellis documented every anomaly. Every whispered suspicion. Every pattern that repeated too perfectly to be coincidence. He didn't know exactly why. He didn't know what would come of it. But he understood that threads, once tangled, can't be untangled without unraveling the whole fabric. By the end of the week, even the halls carried tension. Footsteps were measured. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Phones were held a little closer. Eyes scanned ceilings, floors, screens. Every ordinary sound became charged with meaning. Every glance carried suspicion. Every memo hid a story. And in that tension, the system, for the first time in decades, showed human fragility. Not weakness. Not failure. But vulnerability. Because no matter how much power someone has, a single person, with a folder and a question, can begin to unravel it. And that is exactly what had begun. The threads had tangled. The threads had shifted. And no one in the West Wing could predict where they would lead next. In every story, there is a moment when the observer becomes part of the narrative. Ellis Keaton had crossed that threshold. He wasn't just watching anymore. He wasn't merely cataloging irregularities. He was participating, whether he liked it or not. And participation comes with a new kind of pressure. A weight that shifts in your chest. That makes ordinary hallways feel like minefields. That turns the hum of fluorescent lights into a counting clock. Tick, tick, tick. Because every choice you make from that point forward can change the story itself. He spent hours analyzing footage. Every tilt of the head. Every subtle pause. Every glance. The tension between two people who understood power in fundamentally different ways. He noticed things no one else did. A barely audible sigh. A hand twitching over a document. A shadow falling across a face in a way that implied more than words ever could. It wasn't conspicuous. It wasn't obvious. But it mattered. Every small detail was a thread in the web of influence and control that extended far beyond the walls of the Roosevelt Room. And Ellis knew something crucial. The observer sees what the participants cannot. Trump moved through the West Wing with deliberate energy. Each step measured. Every word considered. The gestures subtle but precise. Control, he understood, was not maintained by shouting or intimidation alone. It was preserved through perception, through the rhythm of expectation, through the small, invisible cues that told people exactly where power lay. Mamdani, on the other hand, seemed almost untouched by the conventional rules. He existed in a parallel orbit. Each word he spoke, each movement he made, was intentional. Yet invisible in its impact until the system reacted. It was a collision of forces, the overt and the subtle, the visible and the hidden. The West Wing staff began to sense it. Whispers in corridors. Questions held back. Meetings delayed. Documents double-checked. Nothing confirmed. Nothing denied. Yet the tension was tangible. Every person felt it, even if they didn't understand why. And that's the paradox of power. Sometimes the most significant moves happen in silence. Sometimes the loudest events leave no record. Sometimes the observer is the one who sees the story in its entirety. And has the capacity to change it. Ellis made his choice. Not to leak. Not to intervene directly. Not yet. But to document meticulously. To follow the threads wherever they led. To understand the network, the patterns, the subtle logic beneath the chaos. Because knowledge, once grasped, is a weapon. And the West Wing was filled with potential battles that hadn't even been imagined. As he compiled logs, timestamps, and footage, he noticed something that froze him in place. A pattern that repeated across offices, across communications, across timelines. Small, almost imperceptible anomalies. But connected in a way that suggested deliberate orchestration. The building itself seemed to pulse with the pattern. A rhythm hidden from most. But impossible to ignore once seen. And for the first time, Ellis realized. He wasn't just observing. He had an edge. An edge that could shift the balance. But edges are dangerous. Edges cut both ways. By evening, the West Wing had transformed. No one could pinpoint exactly why. No one could articulate the feeling. But the tension had reached a threshold. Every move, every word, every glance carried weight. Every hallway echoed with unspoken consequences. Every silent observer had become a participant. And in that charged atmosphere, one certainty emerged. The system would never be the same again. Because once you see the hidden patterns, once you understand the silent architecture of control, you can never unsee it. And for Ellis Keaton, the observer's edge was both a gift and a burden. It was power he never asked for. And responsibility he could not ignore. There is always an unseen hand in every room of power. Sometimes it guides. Sometimes it restrains. Sometimes it pushes silently, shaping events before anyone notices. And in the days following the confrontation, the hand had become impossible to ignore. Ellis Keaton noticed it first in the smallest things. A folder placed on a desk that wasn't there moments before. A document misfiled in plain sight. A meeting rescheduled without explanation. A phone call that seemed unnecessary, until he checked the timestamp. Everything was too precise. Everything was too coordinated. Everything was too intentional. The system wasn't failing. It was operating exactly as someone designed it. And yet, paradoxically, it was beginning to unravel. Trump, at the center of this unfolding storm, reacted instinctively. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He measured, analyzed, and adapted. Because in the architecture of power, control is not about volume. Control is about perception. Control is about timing. And he sensed the unseen hand moving. Its nudges subtle. Its influence pervasive. Its consequences dangerous. Mamdani, as always, remained a shadow in the orbit. He observed the ripple effects without interference. Understanding that systems are most fragile when they believe they are invincible. The staff began to feel it. Whispers became questions. Questions became hesitation. Hesitation became fear. Even minor decisions carried weight. Even routine memos could set off a chain reaction. And somewhere within that tension, the unseen hand exerted its influence. Not visible. Not audible. But palpable. Every step, every glance, every document now seemed part of a larger design. Ellis followed the patterns. He traced emails, memos, and internal communications. He mapped schedules and anomalies. He tracked phone logs and meeting notes. And slowly, the picture emerged. Someone, some force, had been anticipating the moves of every individual in the West Wing. Every reaction. Every hesitation. Every mistake. The unseen hand wasn't just guiding events. It was orchestrating them. And the realization hit him like a shockwave. They had been playing a game he didn't fully understand. A game where the rules were invisible. And the stakes were far higher than anyone admitted. That night, as Ellis sat alone in the dim glow of his tablet, he felt the weight of it. The hand was everywhere. And yet, no one could prove it. Power had a pulse, and he had felt it. Control had a rhythm, and he had followed it. The narrative had a current, and he had been caught in it. But for the first time, he understood something critical. You cannot confront an unseen hand directly. You cannot fight what you cannot see. But you can trace it. You can follow it. You can understand it. And understanding is the first step toward mastery. Outside, the West Wing slept uneasily. Hallways that had seemed mundane now held a quiet tension. Offices that had seemed routine now carried invisible weight. Lights flickered. Phones buzzed. Footsteps echoed a little too deliberately. And somewhere, beyond the perception of ordinary staff, the unseen hand continued to shape the story. Quietly, efficiently, inevitably. Ellis knew one thing with certainty. This was only the beginning. And those who underestimated the power of the unseen hand would soon regret it. There comes a moment in every story of power when the shadows begin to move. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. But literally. When the people who think they control everything realize that the control is an illusion. And that moment arrived quietly, yet unmistakably, in the West Wing. Ellis Keaton watched as patterns he had been tracing for days converged. Emails. Schedules. Phone logs. Meetings. Footage from the Roosevelt Room. All seemingly disconnected. All seemingly ordinary. Until they weren't. Suddenly, the dots aligned. The anomalies revealed a structure. A hidden architecture. And at the center of that architecture were the shadows. Not people. Not offices. Not titles. Shadows. Movements unseen. Decisions made in silence. Actions carried out in anticipation of what no one else could yet perceive. Trump felt it first. A subtle hesitation in aides. A pause in communications. A glance that lingered too long. He could sense that momentum had shifted. That the invisible rhythm of the system was no longer his alone to command. And that the shadows, those unseen forces that had always been part of the architecture, were beginning to move independently. Mamdani, ever observant, recognized the signs. He saw the hesitation, the silent communications, the ripple effects of minor decisions. He understood that the moment of shadows is not a dramatic reveal. It is a quiet awakening. A recognition that the system is alive, and it reacts to knowledge, fear, and attention. Ellis felt it most acutely. Every keystroke, every glance at the tablet, every note in his log carried weight beyond his comprehension. He was no longer a bystander. He was part of the network. Part of the current. And every movement he made sent ripples through the invisible web. You felt this before. The quiet electricity of anticipation. The tension that builds not from chaos, but from potential. The sense that a single moment, a single choice, could redefine everything. In the hallways, whispers had become deliberate. Check this. Verify that. Did anyone notice? Questions, careful and precise, were exchanged in corners, behind closed doors. Phones were muted. Documents were double-checked. Even trivial actions carried a sense of gravity. The shadows were everywhere. And yet no one could see them clearly. By midday, the first cracks appeared in the outer veneer of control. Schedules conflicted. Messages misrouted. Briefings delayed. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing public. But to those inside, the weight of the unseen was undeniable. Power had always been measured in visibility, titles, offices, access, and authority. Now it was being measured in reaction. And reaction, when manipulated by shadows, is unpredictable. Ellis realized something essential. The story wasn't in the documents. It wasn't in the footage. It wasn't in the whispered warnings. The story was in the responses. In how people moved, hesitated, decided, or faltered when confronted with something they couldn't fully understand. And that is where the shadows thrive. In the cracks between intention and action. In the gaps between perception and reality. In the silent pauses when no one dares to speak. By evening, the West Wing had transformed into a place where every choice mattered. Every glance. Every word. Every keystroke. Nothing was inconsequential. The shadows were no longer background players. They had become the actors. And everyone else, aides, analysts, the men at the center of the confrontation, were now performing in a world subtly dictated by forces they could feel but not fully see. Ellis leaned back in his chair. The tablet rested lightly in his hands, but the gravity of its content pressed against his chest. And in that moment, he understood. The shadows were patient. Relentless. Inevitable. And they had already begun to shape the story. Every story has a tipping point. A moment when subtle forces collide. When minor deviations amplify. And when the weight of unseen influence becomes too great to ignore. In the West Wing, that moment arrived quietly. Not with alarms. Not with headlines. But with the slow, inexorable pulse of the system itself. Ellis Keaton felt it first in the hum of electronics. Computers. Phones. Security systems. They all seemed to vibrate with a new frequency. A subtle signal he could feel in his fingertips. In the shallow rhythm of his heartbeat. The footage, the folders, the anomalies. They had moved from curiosities to catalysts. Every minor irregularity was now part of a chain reaction. And the chain had begun to tighten. Trump, always attuned to rhythm and perception, noticed it too. A hesitation in conversation. A misstep in scheduling. A look that lasted a second too long. He realized, with that instinctive awareness leaders acquire over decades, that the balance of power had shifted. Not dramatically. Not with chaos. But incrementally. Invisible, imperceptible to most. Yet undeniable to those who paid attention. Mamdani observed silently. He did not move impulsively. He did not speak loudly. He simply noted the subtle movements, the pauses, the changes in tempo. Because the tipping point is not always dramatic. It is quiet. Measured. Almost invisible until it has passed. And then, suddenly, it is. Elsewhere in the West Wing, the staff felt the tension accumulate. Calls were returned hesitantly. Emails double-checked before sending. Folders re-examined. Even casual conversations carried an unspoken gravity. Everyone felt it. No one could name it. But the building itself had shifted. The rhythm of influence was no longer predictable. The unseen forces, the shadows, the patterns, the threads, were moving too fast to follow. Ellis knew what this meant. He had observed enough to realize the consequences. The tipping point is the place where observation becomes action. Where knowledge becomes responsibility. Where witnessing alone is no longer sufficient. And in that moment, he made a decision. Not to speak yet. Not to reveal the folder or the footage. But to prepare. To watch. To anticipate. Because tipping points do not wait. They are inevitable. And the consequences of inaction are immediate. Trump and Mamdani both sensed it, differently, of course. Trump, through instinct and experience, understood that the equilibrium had been disturbed. Mamdani, through calm calculation, recognized that the disturbance would soon reveal deeper truths. The system, once silent, was now alive. Reacting. Testing. Shaping outcomes without consent. And the most ordinary individuals, the analysts, the aides, the clerks who thought themselves invisible, were suddenly part of the story. By evening, the atmosphere was electric. Corridors buzzed with tension. Phones vibrated in pockets. Documents sat unopened, yet heavy with significance. Footsteps echoed like warnings. No one in the West Wing could escape it. No one could ignore it. The tipping point had arrived. The system had shifted. And every participant, seen or unseen, powerful or ordinary, would feel the consequences. Ellis leaned back in his chair, finally exhaling. Because he knew this. Once the tipping point is reached, there is no going back. After a tipping point, everything reverberates. Not loudly. Not visibly. But subtly, endlessly, like echoes bouncing off invisible walls. In the West Wing, those echoes spread faster than anyone could predict. Ellis Keaton noticed it immediately. Every email, every conversation, every minor adjustment seemed to ripple beyond its origin. A memo that once would have passed unnoticed now carried weight. A hallway comment whispered casually became a question in someone else's mind. A simple glance became suspicion, and suspicion became action. You felt it before. The sensation when small changes magnify. When minor truths find hidden channels. And suddenly, the world is responding in ways you cannot control. Trump felt the echoes differently. He didn't see them. He didn't hear them. But he could sense the rhythm of attention shifting. Small details he had trusted were now misaligned. The system he relied upon for certainty now whispered uncertainty in every corner. And he moved accordingly. Measured steps, deliberate words, calculated pauses. An invisible tug-of-war between perception and reality. Mamdani understood the echo chamber in its entirety. He didn't need to act aggressively. He didn't need to issue orders or make declarations. The system itself, amplified by human behavior, secrecy, and fear, carried his influence forward. Because once a ripple is created, it grows in ways that no one can anticipate. Ellis observed patterns emerging, almost like a map of unseen currents. A phone call that seemed trivial sparked a cascade of clarifications. A deleted email prompted a review that unearthed discrepancies elsewhere. A misplaced document forced a pause in routine operations. Everything connected. Everything amplified. Nothing stayed isolated. And the most ordinary actors, aides, analysts, clerks, became conduits for these echoes. Every decision, no matter how small, fed the system. Every hesitation became part of the chain reaction. By midday, the echo chamber had grown nearly invisible but unmistakable. The West Wing seemed ordinary. Lights flickered. Phones buzzed. People walked calmly. Yet beneath that calm, a subtle vibration pulsed through the building. A rhythm no one could see directly. But everyone instinctively felt. Ellis realized that knowledge alone was no longer enough. Observation alone was insufficient. Because in an echo chamber, awareness can change outcomes. Decisions now had to account not just for action, but for reaction, for perception, for unintended amplification. Trump moved carefully. Mamdani moved silently. And the staff, caught in the currents of hidden cause and effect, responded reflexively. No one could fully control the echoes. No one could predict all consequences. And yet every participant contributed, willingly or not, to the amplification of influence. By evening, Ellis leaned back in his chair, exhausted but alert. The echoes weren't finished. They were just beginning. The system had transformed into something alive. Responsive. Sensitive. Impossible to fully contain. And in that moment, Ellis understood the truth of power. It isn't always the loudest voice or the clearest order that shapes events. Sometimes it's the invisible, persistent echoes. Subtle, relentless, and impossible to ignore. That dictate the course of history. Friction doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it lingers in the spaces between steps, words, and decisions. And in the West Wing, the friction was quiet, but undeniable. Ellis Keaton felt it in the smallest details. A pause in a phone call. A hesitation before signing a memo. A glance that lingered too long across the hallway. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't a breakdown. It was something subtler, a resistance invisible to the untrained eye. Yet palpable to anyone paying attention. You felt this before. That pressure in the air when something is shifting. When every interaction carries the weight of expectation. And no one knows who will yield first. Trump sensed the friction differently. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was in the timing of replies, the way aides moved just slightly slower than usual, the careful deliberation in meetings that normally ran like clockwork. He understood instinctively that friction in a system is a signal. It indicates pressure points, weaknesses, and the subtle beginnings of change. Mamdani, as always, observed quietly. He noticed the nuances. The way small delays created opportunities. The way hesitation in one corner amplified tension elsewhere. He didn't push, he allowed the friction to reveal itself. Understanding that sometimes the smallest resistance produces the largest consequences. The staff felt it too. Tasks that once felt routine now required calculation. Words had weight. Steps had consequences. Even casual conversations became exercises in strategy. The friction forced awareness. Attention to detail. A recognition that the system was no longer stable. That the equilibrium they had relied on was beginning to erode. Ellis mapped it. Every pause. Every delay. Every slight anomaly in movement or communication. And the pattern emerged. Friction wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was a signal, a subtle pressure applied across the system that exposed weaknesses, revealed priorities, and reshaped the flow of information. By late afternoon, the quiet friction had become palpable. Hallways hummed with tension. Offices vibrated with unspoken anticipation. Even the fluorescent light seemed to hum in sync with the new rhythm of the building. And as Ellis sat at his desk, he realized. Friction is invisible until it shapes outcomes. It is quiet until it becomes unavoidable. And it is subtle until it topples assumptions about control. Trump adjusted his approach. Mamdani observed the micro-changes. And the staff, caught between obedience and adaptation, navigated a world that had grown unpredictable overnight. The friction had begun as a whisper. But whispers have a way of becoming storms. And for those who had once believed they controlled the narrative, the quiet friction was now a force they could not ignore. Every system has a moment of reckoning. Not when the alarm sounds. Not when the press releases arrive. But when the cumulative weight of hidden pressures, subtle anomalies, and quiet resistance can no longer be ignored. In the West Wing, that moment arrived like a slow tremor, shaking corridors, offices, and minds. Ellis Keaton watched it unfold in real time. Emails cascading with corrections. Meetings abruptly shifted or cancelled. Staffers moving like actors in a play where no one knew the script. Every ripple of previous friction had amplified. Every whisper had found its echo. Every anomaly now demanded attention. And the folder, the footage, remained the silent core of it all. Trump felt the gravity of the reckoning differently. It wasn't panic. It wasn't chaos. It was an instinctive recognition, the structures he relied on were under pressure. A pause here. A hesitant word there. A misalignment in protocol, small, subtle, but undeniable. Power, he realized, is not only held in position. It is maintained through perception, through rhythm, through an unseen current of obedience and attention. And that current had shifted. Mamdani, observing, remained calm. He did not act rashly. He did not announce victories. He simply understood the architecture. Frictions, anomalies, whispers, and unseen hands had combined into a force no one could ignore. He allowed the system to reveal itself. To expose its weaknesses. To show the hidden pathways through which influence flowed. Ellis began to see the human side of the reckoning. Staffers who had been confident, precise, and routine now hesitated. Aides questioned their own decisions. Clerks double-checked everything, not because of fear, but because the subtle currents demanded awareness. Every ordinary individual was now a participant in a story that had grown beyond any one person's control. Every action, no matter how small, carried consequences. And then it crystallized. A misfiled memo caused a cascading delay. A phone call intended for one aide reached another. A simple clarification became a chain reaction of adjustments across the building. No one could reverse it. No one could stop it. The system, once predictable, reliable, controlled, had evolved. It was alive. Responsive. Unforgiving. Ellis understood something profound. The moment of reckoning isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always involve confrontation or speeches. It comes quietly. Through accumulated pressure, observation, and the subtle realization that control is an illusion. And in that moment, the West Wing, the heart of American power, was forced to confront a truth few would admit. Order can be disrupted by whispers. Authority can be challenged by observation. Control can be undone by the cumulative weight of small, unnoticed forces. Trump recalibrated. Mamdani watched. And the staff, ordinary, extraordinary, human, adapted. Because once the moment of reckoning arrives, there is no going back. The system has changed. And everyone within it must move differently, or risk being swept aside. Every story must end. But some endings are not conclusions. They are transitions. A shift in rhythm. A recognition that what once was will never return. In the West Wing, the confrontation between Trump and Mamdani had reached its climax. Not with shouting. Not with chaos. But with the quiet reordering of everything. Ellis Keaton sat at his desk, exhausted but aware. The folder, the footage, the anomalies, the whispers. They had revealed a truth few had expected. Systems are not just structures. Systems are living networks of human choices, mistakes, and awareness. He understood now that observation could shape reality. That quiet resistance could ripple outward. That attention, the smallest human recognition, could shift the flow of power itself. Trump, finally, adjusted his stance. Not in anger. Not in pride. But in understanding. Power isn't absolute. It is responsive. It bends to perception, momentum, and subtle forces. And sometimes, the lesson of leadership isn't domination. It's awareness. Mamdani, ever calm, watched as the system settled into a new rhythm. The friction remained. But it was now ordered. The echoes persisted. But they carried purpose rather than panic. And the unseen hands, though still in motion, guided the flow rather than disrupted it. The staff felt it, too. Footsteps were measured. Emails precise but confident. Meetings flowed with cautious efficiency. The West Wing, once rattled by friction and uncertainty, had adapted. Not everyone understood what had changed. Not everyone saw the subtle forces at work. But everyone felt the new rhythm, the pulse of power transformed by knowledge, observation, and human awareness. Ellis leaned back, finally exhaling. He had witnessed tension. He had observed patterns. He had tracked whispers and anomalies. And in doing so, he had seen the truth of systems, power, and people. Change is inevitable. Control is fleeting. Awareness is the only leverage that endures. You've seen this before. Moments when the ordinary becomes extraordinary. When the smallest observation reshapes everything. When a single individual's attention alters the trajectory of events. And now, in the quiet aftermath, the West Wing hummed differently. It had learned. It had adapted. It had survived. Trump walked through the hallways. Mamdani observed quietly. And Ellis, the observer-turned-participant, smiled slightly, knowing the story was not over. But the system had a new rhythm. A rhythm that balanced observation and action. Tension and control. Friction and flow. And in that rhythm, there was hope. Because even in power, even in chaos, even in the most invisible of systems, human awareness can still shape the story. And maybe, just maybe, this is where everything begins again. The West Wing breathed differently now. The shadows lingered. The echoes persisted. And the unseen hand continued its quiet work. But the participants, human, flawed, attentive, had discovered the truth. Power is not held. It is felt. It is observed. It is lived. And in that understanding, the story finally found its quiet, heavy, philosophical close. The West Wing never truly returns to normal. Not after moments like this. Not after tension has been stretched to its limits. And the currents of power have revealed themselves in the most intimate, human ways. Ellis Keaton walked through the halls, noticing details he never would have before. A slightly crooked picture frame. The hum of a printer that didn't belong. A door left ajar that normally would have been closed. These were small things. Insignificant to most. But to someone attuned, they told a story louder than any briefing memo ever could. Trump moved with careful precision, aware that the ripples of his confrontation with Mamdani would continue long after the cameras were gone. He wasn't angry. He wasn't triumphant. He was strategic. Because strategy is not about immediate wins. It's about understanding the new landscape. The invisible currents of influence that have shifted forever. Mamdani, meanwhile, observed quietly. He understood the beauty of aftermath. How systems adjust. How individuals learn. How knowledge, once revealed, spreads like fire in dry grass. The quiet victories, the subtle shifts, the unnoticed consequences. These were the things that endured. Staffers, once caught in the friction and echoes of previous weeks, now moved with cautious efficiency. They had learned. Attention matters. Observation matters. Even small actions carry unseen consequences. The building itself had a new rhythm. Corridors that had once echoed tension now carried a subtler energy. Alert, responsive, aware. Ellis reflected on what he had seen. The confrontation was over. But the story was not complete. Systems, like people, are resilient. They adapt. They evolve. They carry the lessons of pressure, tension, and observation forward. And in the West Wing, the lesson was clear. Power is not simply a position. Power is a living system. And those who understand it best are those who notice the invisible currents first. He glanced at the folder one last time. The footage. The emails. The anomalies. They were more than evidence. They were a map. A guide to understanding the pulse of influence, control, and human behavior. And perhaps, if anyone were wise enough to follow it, they could navigate the next storm. Before it became a hurricane. Outside, the sun was setting. Light spilled through the windows of the West Wing, casting long shadows. A reminder that even in power, even in control, There are forces beyond sight. Unseen hands, quiet friction, subtle echoes. And yet, awareness can shape them. Observation can bend them. And human insight, careful, patient, deliberate, can endure where authority alone fails. Ellis exhaled. The confrontation had ended. But the West Wing had changed forever. The rhythm of power was new. The echoes lingered. And the unseen currents would continue their quiet work. And in that understanding, a single truth remained. The story doesn't end. It evolves. And those who pay attention will always see the next shift first. Power has a pulse. You don't hear it. You don't see it. But you feel it. A subtle rhythm, like a heartbeat beneath every decision, every whisper, every glance. In the aftermath of the West Wing confrontation, that pulse was impossible to ignore. Ellis Keaton felt it first. A quiet vibration in the hallways. The hum of computers and printers that seemed synchronized with thought. A cadence in conversations that carried meaning beyond words. Every detail mattered now. Every pause, every hesitation, every confirmation carried weight. The pulse of power had shifted. Trump moved deliberately. Each step measured. Each word calculated. Every gesture now part of a rhythm he both controlled and reacted to. He understood instinctively that the pulse of influence is fragile. It bends with perception. Shifts with awareness. And responds to pressure, subtle, invisible, relentless. Mamdani observed with quiet precision. He didn't interfere. He didn't need to. Because the pulse itself revealed the truth. Systems are living. Human behavior is predictable. But only if you watch carefully enough. And small disruptions, quiet observations, minor hesitations, the tiniest shifts, can amplify, ripple, and change the outcome completely. The staff moved differently now. Ordinary actions became strategic. Conversations were measured. Emails considered. Meetings approached with a new sense of weight. They had learned something essential. The pulse of power is responsive. And awareness is its guide. Ellis mapped it. He could see the currents of influence. He could trace the echoes of friction. He could identify the hidden patterns, the silent decisions that dictated outcomes. He realized something profound. The pulse is not maintained by authority alone. It is maintained by observation. By recognition. By human insight. And those who notice it first, those who feel it, hold a subtle, enduring advantage. Outside, the corridors seemed ordinary. But Ellis knew better. The pulse was there. Always there. Invisible, relentless, shaping the flow of decisions, reactions, and consequences. And in the center of it all, he understood the quiet truth of power. It is not simply held. It is experienced. It is felt. And it is alive in the spaces between human awareness and human action. Trump, Mamdani, Ellis, the staff, all were moving to the rhythm now. Not fully aware of its shape. Not fully in control. But attuned enough to survive, adapt, and participate in the next chapter. Because power is a pulse. And those who learn its rhythm first will always influence the story that follows. Power is rarely linear. It does not flow in straight lines. It travels through invisible webs. Threads of influence, decision, and awareness connect people, places, and moments in ways few ever notice. Ellis Keaton had been following these threads for weeks now. The folder, the emails, the footage, they were pieces of a larger tapestry. And he finally began to see the full design. Trump moved through the web like a conductor, aware of each strand's tension. A word here. A pause there. A gesture carefully measured. He understood that influence is not always direct. It flows around obstacles, through intermediaries, and sometimes through people who don't even realize they are conduits. Mamdani observed the same web, but differently. He saw the architecture itself. He saw the silent paths of power. The places where friction created openings. And the corridors where a single observation could ripple outward endlessly. Staffers, once unaware of the connections, were now caught in the web's flow. Every decision they made, no matter how small, had consequences beyond comprehension. Every glance, every conversation, every keystroke was a thread. And as the web tightened, as the strands interwove, they realized that control is never absolute. It's negotiated, navigated, and constantly tested. Ellis traced the threads meticulously. The pattern was subtle. Almost invisible. But undeniable. And he understood a profound truth. The web doesn't bend for authority alone. It bends for perception, awareness, and timing. Those who notice the connections first gain leverage. Even without traditional power. The West Wing had transformed into something alive. A living network of influence, attention, and decision-making. Ordinary offices had become nodes. Hallways carried weight. Phones and emails pulsed with invisible currents. And at the center of it all was the silent understanding. Nothing moves randomly. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is part of the web. Trump, aware but unshaken, adapted to its flow. Mamdani, always calculating, let the currents reveal themselves. Ellis, the observer, finally realized that knowledge of the web itself was a form of power. And in that realization, he understood. You do not control the web. You navigate it. You anticipate its rhythm. You respect its complexity. Because the invisible web is patient. It is enduring. It is everywhere. And those who ignore it will be caught. Those who understand it will endure. The West Wing breathed differently now. The echoes persisted. The shadows lingered. The pulse of power flowed in every corner. And in the center of it, Ellis whispered to himself. The story isn't about victory or defeat. It's about understanding the connections that shape everything. Every system has a veil. A layer of normalcy that hides the intricate choreography beneath. Ordinary people walk its corridors, believing that procedures are simple, that authority is clear, that power is tangible. But in the West Wing, that veil had begun to lift. Ellis Keaton noticed it first in the subtle details. A hesitation before entering a room. A glance that lasted too long across a table. A word chosen carefully, as if weighed against unseen consequences. These were small, almost imperceptible signs. But to someone who had been watching the patterns, they told the story in full. Trump sensed the veil lifting, too. Not in panic. Not in frustration. But with a quiet awareness that the dynamics he thought he controlled were now fluid. The confrontation with Mamdani had revealed vulnerabilities. But it had also revealed opportunity. The veil lifting meant that perception now mattered as much as authority. That control was no longer simply about position or title. Mamdani remained steady, observing. He understood that lifting the veil changes everything. People see not just the surface but the mechanisms behind it. When the veil lifts, reactions are amplified. Decisions once routine become strategic. And every action resonates farther than expected. Ellis documented it meticulously. He traced micropatterns across communications. Recorded anomalies in scheduling. And observed the subtle friction that had accumulated into near crisis. And he realized something essential. Once the veil lifts, ignorance is no longer an excuse. Awareness becomes responsibility. Observation becomes influence. And insight becomes power. The staff felt it too. Hallways carried tension like electricity in the air. Documents required more care. Conversations were measured. Even casual steps in the West Wing seemed to resonate in ways they could not fully articulate. The veil lifted. And everything hidden was suddenly visible. Trump adjusted his strategy. Mamdani allowed the web of influence to reveal itself further. Ellis followed every thread, knowing that the story had entered its most delicate stage. Because when the veil lifts, decisions cannot be taken lightly. Power cannot be assumed. And the consequences of a single misstep are magnified. By evening, the West Wing had learned something vital. Control is temporary. Perception is pivotal. And awareness, patient, deliberate, persistent, defines who survives and who falters. The veil lifted completely. But in its clarity came responsibility. And in that responsibility lay the true weight of influence. Ellis exhaled, looking around at the hallways, the offices, the corridors. The story was no longer hidden. It had become tangible, complex, and alive. And in the quiet aftermath, one truth persisted. Understanding the mechanisms behind power is not enough. Mastery comes to those who can navigate them without being consumed. Every story leaves a resonance. It doesn't vanish. It doesn't fade completely. It lingers, echoing through time, decisions, and the spaces between people. In the West Wing, the confrontation between Trump and Mamdani had ended. But the resonance remained, subtle, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Ellis Keaton felt it everywhere. In the rhythm of footsteps along the hallways. In the careful cadence of conversations. In the silence between meetings. It was the aftershock of tension, friction, and observation. A vibration that carried lessons, warnings, and opportunities. Trump moved through the halls with quiet purpose. He had learned something crucial. Power is not static. It cannot be held by force alone. It flows, reacts, and persists through perception, attention, and human awareness. And in that resonance, he could sense both risk and potential. Mamdani watched silently, as always. The resonance of the confrontation had revealed what he already understood. Systems are living entities. They respond to pressure, adapt to friction, and evolve in ways the unaware cannot predict. Those who ignore the resonance are swept aside. Those who understand it survive. Those who master it shape the future. Ellis traced the final threads of influence, mapping connections, decisions, and anomalies. He understood the invisible currents that guided the West Wing. He understood the echo chamber, the friction, the unseen hands, the pulse of power. And he realized something profound. The story is never truly over. It evolves. It teaches. It resonates. Staffers moved differently now. Not out of fear. Not out of obligation. But out of awareness. Every glance, every gesture, every decision carried weight. They had been shaped by the currents of power. And now they moved in sync with its rhythm. Trump and Mamdani, each in their own way, had adapted. Neither had total control. Neither had absolute authority. But both understood the flow, the currents, the resonance. And in that understanding lay influence, subtle, enduring, and almost invisible. The West Wing itself seemed alive. Hallways carried energy. Documents hummed with purpose. The air vibrated with possibility. And in the quiet spaces between observation and action, one truth remained. Power is not held in titles, rooms, or commands. Power is resonance, the echo of awareness, choice, and human presence. Ellis exhaled, finally letting the weight settle. The confrontation was over. The story had reached its conclusion. But the resonance would persist, shaping events, shaping decisions, shaping history. And maybe, just maybe, that is the true nature of influence. It never ends. It continues. It resonates. The West Wing breathed differently now. The shadows lingered. The echoes persisted. And the unseen currents flowed quietly, shaping the next story, the next confrontation, the next moment of reckoning. And somewhere in that rhythm, humans remained, flawed, aware, and capable of steering the invisible hand. Even after resonance fades, the system never stops moving. The West Wing breathed, shifted, and adjusted quietly. Like a living organism learning from its past. Ellis Keaton walked the halls, noting subtle changes. The way aides paused just slightly longer before replying. The way memos were handled with new care. The way conversations carried an unspoken weight. As if everyone sensed the lingering aftershock of the confrontation. Even if no one could name it. Trump observed, too. Not with visible intensity. Not with anger or triumph. But with measured awareness. He understood that influence is not static. It is shaped by observation, attention, and perception. And the quiet turn of human behavior. The small choices that ripple through a system. Often matter more than orders shouted or commands given. Mamdani remained the silent observer. He didn't intervene. He didn't need to. Because the quiet turn reveals itself to those who notice. Small hesitations, micro-adjustments, shifts in tone. These subtle currents dictate how events unfold. And in the end, the quiet turn can carry consequences greater than any confrontation. Ellis realized something essential. The moment after the storm is not about action alone. It is about reflection. It is about seeing what has changed. What has persisted. And what has shifted invisibly beneath the surface. The staff moved differently now. They had adapted to the new rhythm. The unseen currents guided them subtly. Yet they also carried agency. They understood, finally, that awareness, their own attention and choices, could influence the system's next movement. Outside, the West Wing looked the same. But inside, everything had changed. The pulse persisted. The web remained active. The echoes lingered. And the shadows, though unseen, were still in motion. Ellis paused, reflecting on the truth he had learned. The quiet turn is where human insight meets systemic pressure. Where observation shapes outcomes. Where influence is not about force, but about subtlety, patience, and awareness. And in that quiet turn, there is power. Enduring. Invisible. Impossible to ignore. The West Wing had survived. It had adapted. It had learned. And in the silence of that adaptation, one truth remained. History is shaped not only by confrontation, but by the quiet turns that follow. Even when the system adapts, the shadows remain. They do not announce themselves. They do not reveal their paths. They move quietly, threading through corridors, conversations, and decisions. And in the West Wing, the shadows had learned to coexist with awareness. Ellis Keaton noticed them in subtle ways. A glance exchanged behind closed doors. A pause before entering a meeting. A hallway left empty when someone should have been there. These were small signs, almost imperceptible. But they told him more than any briefing or report could. The shadows were still shaping events. Still guiding influence. Still testing perception. Trump felt their weight differently. Not as fear. Not as paranoia. But as a silent reminder that influence is never absolute. Even in moments of triumph, even after the pulse has shifted. Unseen forces move alongside decisions, shaping outcomes subtly but inexorably. Mamdani observed, as always, quietly and deliberately. He understood the shadow's role. They are neither good nor evil. Merely the natural consequence of complexity, human behavior, and systemic friction. And those who understand them can navigate, anticipate, and even leverage them. The staff, now attuned to the rhythm, sensed something too. They could feel the quiet tension. The invisible hand that guided actions without ever being seen. They learned to move with awareness. To respect the currents of influence. and to act in ways that did not disrupt the fragile equilibrium. Ellis mapped it all in his mind. The web of power. The echoes. The friction. And now the shadows. They were not obstacles. They were signals. And understanding them was not about control. It was about survival, adaptation, and foresight. By evening, the West Wing seemed calm. The pulse of power had stabilized. The quiet turns had been integrated. But the shadows persisted, reminding everyone that vigilance is never optional. Ellis exhaled slowly. The confrontation was over. The resonance had passed. The veil had lifted. But the shadows, subtle, persistent, invisible, would always remain. And in their presence, one truth endured. Power is never fully seen. Control is never complete. And the story continues, shaped by those who notice what others cannot. The West Wing breathed silently. The echoes lingered. The pulse flowed. And the shadows, patient, relentless, moved alongside history, shaping its next chapter. Even in calm, change is never absent. The West Wing had adapted. The pulse of power had found a rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, a subtle shift was already taking shape. Ellis Keaton noticed it first. Not in memos. Not in emails. Not in footsteps or voices. He felt it in the air. A minute change in timing. A hesitation in communication. A pattern that suggested the system was moving in a slightly different direction. Trump observed the shift instinctively. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't headline-making. It was almost imperceptible. A minor pause in a response. A subtle glance across the room. A decision taken a fraction of a second earlier or later than expected. And yet, Trump understood instinctively. Small shifts can have enormous consequences. Minor variations accumulate. And influence is measured not in actions alone, but in how the system responds to them. Mamdani, always patient, remained the quiet observer. He understood that these subtle shifts often dictate the trajectory of events long before anyone notices. It is in the imperceptible movements that power recalibrates. That priorities realign. That influence finds its true expression. The staff sensed it too. A change in protocol. A modification of schedules. A different weight to instructions. They adapted without fully realizing why. The subtle shift had begun to ripple through the West Wing. Quietly, invisibly, but undeniably. Ellis mapped it in his mind. The echoes, the friction, the pulse, and now the shift. All were connected. Every thread mattered. Every observation shaped outcomes. He realized something essential. The system is never static. It evolves. Sometimes imperceptibly. Sometimes catastrophically. And those who notice first gain a subtle, enduring advantage. By nightfall, the subtle shift had settled into rhythm. The West Wing appeared unchanged. Ordinary, controlled, predictable. But underneath, currents flowed differently now. The invisible hand had moved. The web of influence had adjusted. And the shadows, quiet and patient, followed along, observing, shaping, waiting. Ellis exhaled, understanding the lesson. Change does not always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it waits, invisible. Until a single, unobserved moment becomes the fulcrum for the next wave of consequence. And in that understanding, one truth persisted. To navigate power successfully, you must feel the pulse. Map the web. Watch the shadows. And notice the subtle shift before it shapes you. All systems reach a tipping point. Sometimes it comes abruptly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, unnoticed, like water rising in a hidden channel. And in the West Wing, the tipping wave had begun. Ellis Keaton felt it first. Small anomalies were no longer isolated. Minor hesitations had accumulated. Friction had become tension. The subtle shift he had tracked days ago had grown. Layer upon layer. Thread upon thread. Until it began to affect everything. Trump noticed it too, in the cadence of meetings. In the way aides reacted. In the rhythm of information flow. It was not panic. It was awareness. The pulse of influence had accelerated subtly. And the system, which once seemed predictable, was now moving along a new trajectory. Mamdani observed silently, as always. He understood the power of accumulation. The invisible forces, echoes, friction, shadows, shifts, had converged. The tipping wave does not announce itself. It simply reaches a point where adaptation is no longer optional. And in that moment, small actions become decisive. Minor observations turn into leverage. Every participant, no matter how ordinary, influences outcomes. The staff began to feel it. A misplaced document. A delayed email. A hesitation in verbal confirmation. Each tiny event carried disproportionate weight. The system was no longer steady. It leaned. It swayed. And everyone inside it had to adjust, quickly, consciously, deliberately. Ellis mapped it all mentally. The pulse. The web. The echoes. The friction. The shadows. The subtle shifts. And now, the wave. He realized. The tipping point is not chaos. It is consequence. It is the inevitable outcome of accumulated awareness, observation, and choice. Trump recalibrated in real time. Mamdani let the system reveal itself further. And the staff, now caught in the wave, responded instinctively, adapting to a rhythm they barely understood. By evening, the West Wing had changed yet again. Not visibly. Not in headlines. But in currents, in flows, in the invisible web that guides decisions and shapes influence. The tipping wave had passed, for now. Leaving behind new patterns, new rhythms. And a single enduring truth. Systems evolve. Power shifts. And those who notice the wave first ride it. While the unobservant are swept aside. Ellis exhaled slowly. The story was far from over. But he understood. The tipping wave had revealed the hidden architecture of influence. And knowing it was the first step to navigating it. Some things never truly end. The confrontation, the friction, the subtle shifts, the tipping wave. They leave traces. Invisible patterns etched into the rhythm of the system. And in the West Wing, that rhythm endured. Ellis Keaton moved through the halls, aware of every nuance. The pulse of influence was steady now. But tempered by lessons learned. The web remained complex. The shadows persistent. The subtle shifts constant. Everything had changed. Yet the building seemed unchanged. Trump walked with measured confidence. He knew the pulse. He had felt the wave. And he understood, finally, that authority is not maintained through force alone. It is maintained through observation. Adaptation. And an instinctive sense of the system's underlying rhythm. Mamdani remained the quiet observer. He knew the enduring rhythm better than anyone. The lessons of friction, resonance, shadows, and tipping waves had merged. They had revealed the living architecture of influence. A network responsive to attention, action, and insight. And in that network, patience was power. Observation was power. Subtlety was power. The staff had changed too. No one could act without awareness now. Every action had weight. Every decision mattered. Every person understood, even unconsciously, that influence flows where attention leads. The West Wing had become a living system of human insight. A network of observation, adaptation, and rhythm. Ellis paused in a hallway, reflecting. He understood something essential. Power is not static. Control is never total. But influence, subtle, enduring, alive, is shaped by those who notice, who adapt, who respond with awareness. And that is the rhythm that endures. The lights flickered. A door clicked. Steps echoed in the hallways. The West Wing breathed, alive with invisible currents. Moving quietly, persistently, inexorably. And in that rhythm, one truth remained. The story continues. Not in chaos. Not in confrontation. But in the enduring pulse of observation, awareness, and human choice. Ellis exhaled one final time. The confrontation was over. The lessons were learned. The rhythm endured. And for those who understood it, the West Wing would never be the same.